My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 32 years old, and I work as a gallery curator in Boston. My life has always been quiet, surrounded by canvases and sculpture, but nothing in art ever prepared me for the moment when my family decided to turn me into an exhibit of shame. It happened on the day of my grandmother Eleanor's will reading. The room was filled with relatives dressed in black, their whispers sharp, their perfume mixing with the stale air of old wood and tension. My parents sat at the center of the long mahogany table like rulers presiding over their kingdom. Their pride was fixed entirely on my older brother Daniel, the golden son who never had to question his worth. I sat at the end, my posture straight but my stomach tight, knowing already what was about to happen but praying I was wrong. The lawyer, a tall man with gray temples and a crisp navy suit, adjusted his papers and began. His voice echoed in the chamber, steady and calm. One by one, he listed minor bequests, charities, distant cousins, loyal staff. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. He turned his gaze toward Daniel. "To Daniel Brooks," the lawyer said, "your grandmother leaves you $20 million. Gasps, then applause filled the room. My parents' faces lit up with pride as though Daniel had achieved something grand, when in truth he had simply been handed everything. My aunts and uncles nodded in approval, their eyes shining as though witnessing destiny fulfilled. Daniel leaned back, his confidence swelling, flashing that familiar smirk that had followed me since childhood. I clenched my hands together beneath the table. I tried to stay composed, though I could feel the sting of comparison pressing down like a weight. Still, I braced myself. Surely there would be something for me, a token, a message, some acknowledgement that my grandmother saw me too. The lawyer continued. His tone shifted slightly, no longer celebratory, but flat. "To Natalie Brooks, your grandmother leaves you nothing. Your parents wish you to make your own money." The words cut deeper than any silence could have. They hung in the air, final and merciless. The relatives avoided my eyes, but I could sense their pity. A quiet ripple of awkward chuckles moved through the room, and I caught Daniel whispering, just loud enough, "Guess you finally know your place, sis." Heat flooded my cheeks. My parents looked at me with an expression that was not cruelty, but satisfaction, as if they had waited years for this performance to confirm before everyone that I was not worthy of carrying the Brooks legacy. I could not speak. I wanted to shout, to demand recognition for my years of work, for my independence, for my relentless attempts to earn their respect. But my throat locked. Every glance at me was a spotlight, burning me alive. It was not just about money. It was the deliberate statement that I was insignificant, that my existence was disposable, that my life had no value in their carefully constructed empire. The shame pressed into my bones. I sat still, silent, humiliated in front of those who had watched me grow up. At that table, surrounded by applause for Daniel and contempt for me, I felt I had been erased. And yet, as the lawyer shuffled his papers, I sensed the room was not finished. Something remained, hidden behind his careful eyes, waiting to be revealed. The lawyer did not close his folder. Instead, he rested his hand on the table and tapped his pen once, a small sound that sliced through the whispers. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at my parents. "There remains," he said with deliberate calm, "a sealed instruction from Eleanor Brooks." The room shifted. Relatives straightened in their chairs, exchanging puzzled glances. Daniel's smirk froze for the first time. My parents stiffened, their posture tight, their pride suddenly brittle. From the leather briefcase, the lawyer drew out a heavy envelope sealed with deep red wax, stamped with the Brooks family crest. The seal gleamed under the light like a silent warning. He placed it on the polished table, letting it sit there, unbroken. "This instruction," he continued, "is to be revealed at the conclusion of the reading." A low murmur spread across the room. Some leaned forward, eager, while others whispered nervously. Daniel forced a laugh, brittle and defensive. "It's probably just some sentimental note. Grandma always liked her drama." But the lawyer's eyes gave nothing away. His fingers lingered on the envelope as though it contained something far more than words. My father cleared his throat. My mother's jaw tightened. Their discomfort was visible, impossible to disguise. I sat still, staring at the envelope as if it glowed. My humiliation still burned, but beneath it something else stirred. An unexpected spark of possibility. Why had Grandma left this? Why seal it? Why wait until the end? For as long as I could remember, Daniel had been the chosen one. He was praised for every effortless achievement, while I was dismissed as a dreamer, someone who wasted time on books, art, and ideas that did not make money. At that table, surrounded by relatives who applauded my brother and ignored me, I had accepted my role as the shadow. Yet that envelope felt different. It was as if my grandmother had left behind a whisper only for me, one final gesture she had hidden away from their control. The silence thickened. No one moved. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his smugness cracking, though he tried to hide it with another laugh. My parents avoided my eyes, their unease undeniable. I lowered my gaze to the polished wood of the table, trying to contain the flicker of hope rising within me. For years, I had been told I was nothing, but the way the lawyer treated that envelope told me otherwise. In my chest, words formed unbidden. They had given Daniel $20 million and told me to go, make my own money, but Grandma's lawyer had a hidden truth that belonged to me, a truth so heavy it would shatter the performance of power my parents had staged, a truth that would make them scream. My heart pounded. I did not yet know what was written inside, but I knew it was not for Daniel, it was not for my parents. It was for me. The lawyer's hand left the envelope at last, but its presence dominated the room. Every relative sat uneasy, glancing between my brother's smug face, my parents' strained silence, and the sealed truth waiting like thunder above us. No one dared speak. The silence stretched, longer and sharper, until it became unbearable. My pulse roared in my ears. I sat at the end of the table, humiliated yet trembling with a strange certainty. The story of my family was not over. It was only beginning. Growing up in the Brooks household meant living under a spotlight that was never meant for me. From the moment my brother Daniel could form sentences, he was treated as though he carried the family's future in his small hands. Our dinner table was not a place of warmth or stories about school. It was a miniature boardroom where my father discussed stock prices and market swings while my mother nodded with sharp precision. Even as children, Daniel spoke their language fluently, and I sat quietly, clutching crayons or doodling on the corners of napkins, invisible in their world of numbers. I remember one evening particularly well. I was 8, Daniel was 12. My father leaned forward at the table explaining how one company's shares had risen because of a merger. Daniel, with a voice steady and far too confident for his age, interrupted him mid-sentence. "Actually, Dad, if they had waited until the next quarter, they could have doubled their gains," he said. The table burst into delighted laughter. My father slapped him on the back proudly, while my mother praised his foresight, calling him our little economist. Their pride filled the room, spilling over me like a flood that never touched my skin. In that same moment, I had been sketching a small bird on the napkin beside my plate, shading its wings with the dull end of a pencil I had snuck from my backpack. When my mother's eyes landed on me, she frowned. "Natalie, why do you waste your time with scribbles? Art will never put food on the table." Her words cut deeper than she realized. Daniel's interruption had earned him praise. My quiet creativity earned me disdain. That was the pattern, repeated endlessly. When Daniel spoke, rooms leaned in. When I spoke, silence followed, then dismissive smiles. Teachers called him a prodigy. Family friends said he was destined for Wall Street. My father reminded him constantly that he was the Brooks heir, the torchbearer of generations. I became the background character in my own home, the daughter who didn't fit into the empire my parents worshipped. Even when we were children, Daniel wore that crown effortlessly. He was handsome, articulate, always confident. Relatives doted on him, bringing him puzzles and games that involved numbers or strategy. For me, they brought nothing, or at best, a generic book they had grabbed on the way to our house. I devoured those books as though they were lifelines, because within their pages I found color, imagination, and stories that reminded me I was more than the empty chair they treated me as. One summer, we were invited to a relative's house near Cape Cod. While the adults drank wine and spoke about property investments, Daniel stood proudly in the center of the room explaining supply and demand curves he had memorized from one of Father's business magazines. He was only 13, but the crowd applauded as though he were already a broker on Wall Street. I sat on the porch, away from the noise, sketching seashells and waves with a stub of charcoal. My aunt wandered outside, glanced at my paper, and sighed. "Such a sweet hobby," she said, before walking back inside to marvel at Daniel. Sweet hobby. That phrase lodged itself in my memory, a soft dismissal of everything I loved. The cruelest part was how natural it felt to them. My parents never raised their voices at me. They did not need to. Their constant comparison, their endless adoration for Daniel, was louder than any scolding. My victories, small as they were brushed aside. When I won a regional art contest at 15, my father didn't even attend the ceremony. That same week, Daniel closed a deal in a mock investment competition at school, and my parents threw a dinner party to celebrate. Guests toasted his genius while my ribbon lay forgotten in a drawer. I learned to swallow my hurt, to pretend I did not care, but the truth was, every ignored achievement, every cutting remark, carved into me slowly. My identity became the opposite of Daniel. If he was the golden child, shining with their approval, then I was the shadow they allowed to exist because families cannot entirely erase their unwanted children. Looking back, I understand now why the humiliation at the will reading cut so deeply. It was not new. It was a continuation of the same play my family had staged since childhood. Daniel was always the headline, the prodigy, the heir. I was always the afterthought, the girl with sketches on napkins, told to be practical, told to stop dreaming, told that her worth could not be measured in creativity. Yet, even then, I knew something they could not see. While they built Daniel into a tower of gold, they forgot that towers can crumble. And while they ignored me, I was quietly building something stronger inside myself, an understanding of beauty, resilience, and a way of seeing the world that numbers could never capture. That truth would take years to surface, but the seed was already planted at that dinner table, between the laughter at Daniel's cleverness and the disdain for my bird sketch. A seed my grandmother must have noticed even if no one else did. When it came time to choose my college path, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could earn their respect by being honest about what I loved. Sitting at the long oak table in our dining room, I told my parents I had been accepted to New York University and that I wanted to study art history. For the first time, I felt a small flicker of pride. I had worked hard, earned scholarships, and had a vision for my future. My father looked at me as though I had just announced I planned to throw my life away. Then he laughed, not kindly, but with the sharp edge of ridicule. Art history? Natalie, do you think anyone pays for a degree like that? That is not a career, that is a hobby. You should take economics, finance, something with substance. His laughter hung in the air, echoing louder than any slap could have. My mother did not laugh. Her silence was colder than his ridicule. She pressed her lips into a thin line, folded her napkin with deliberate precision, and said nothing. The absence of her support was worse than my father's mockery. It was as though she had erased me entirely in that moment. The decision was swift. They informed me that if I insisted on pursuing art history, I would do so on my own. No tuition support, no allowance, no safety net. You want to chase dreams, then fund them yourself, my father declared. The words were final, like a door slamming shut. Meanwhile, Daniel received the opposite treatment. He chose business and economics at Harvard, and the red carpet was rolled out for him. Full tuition, generous living expenses, a car, connections to alumni networks my father cultivated. His success was considered inevitable, a worthy investment. Mine was deemed a waste before it even began. So, I left home with a single suitcase, a partial scholarship, and a heart full of both determination and dread. New York was dazzling, overwhelming, and unforgiving. I juggled classes with part-time jobs, waiting tables, tutoring, even shelving books in the library until midnight. I signed loan papers with trembling hands, knowing I was chaining myself to debt but refusing to give up. There were nights when exhaustion blurred my vision, when I would cry quietly in the dorm bathroom, biting my sleeve so no one would hear. Yet, even in the darkest hours, I felt a strange freedom. For the first time, I was living a life that belonged to me, not to their expectations. My art history classes filled me with a sense of wonder I had never felt at home. Discussing Renaissance painters, tracing the brushstrokes of forgotten masters, I realized I could see beauty where others only saw expense. That vision gave me strength. Still, the comparisons never stopped. Daniel called occasionally, not to check on me, but to boast about his internships at investment firms, his professors praising his talent, his easy path carved by our parents' influence. I congratulated him with practiced cheer while hiding the burn in my chest. He would never know the weight of walking miles through snow because I could not afford subway fare or skipping meals to pay for textbooks. At family holidays, the divide became even clearer. Relatives applauded Daniel's path, calling him brilliant, the pride of the Brooks family. When they asked about me, my parents responded with vague shrugs or changed the subject. I was the outsider, the disappointment, the one who chose poorly. Looking back, I see that their rejection shaped me as much as their favoritism shaped Daniel. They believed cutting me off would break me, that I would crawl back begging to switch majors. Instead, it hardened me. It forced me to stand on my own feet, to fight for every inch of progress. I was no longer just the forgotten child, as I was the outsider, yes, but an outsider building a foundation no one could take from me. When the weight of rejection pressed hardest against my chest, there was one person who never turned away from me. My grandmother, Eleanor, became the single thread connecting me back to a sense of belonging. She did not live in Boston anymore. She had moved to a smaller house by the coast after my grandfather passed. Yet, even from a distance, she managed to make me feel less invisible. At first, her gestures came quietly. Every few weeks, a small envelope would arrive at my mailbox in New York. Inside, there might be a $20 bill, sometimes $50, always tucked into a handwritten note. Her script was elegant, old-fashioned, slanting slightly to the right. She would write things like, "Buy yourself a warm meal," or, "I know textbooks cost more than they should. This is just to ease the burden." Those little contributions never erased my financial struggles, but they carried something far greater than money. They reminded me that at least one person believed I mattered. Phone calls soon followed. She had a voice that seemed to soften even the harshest day. Whenever I picked up, she asked not about grades or resumes, but about how I felt, what paintings I was studying, which museum I had visited. I could hear genuine interest in her tone, as if my world of colors and canvases held as much weight as Daniel's spreadsheets and stocks. She often ended our calls with words I carried like a secret talisman. "Natalie, your vision is not a weakness. It is your gift." I remember one winter in particular, when the snow in New York piled so high the city felt frozen in place. I had been working double shifts and had little left for groceries. Out of nowhere, she appeared at my dorm, bundled in her wool coat, cheeks red from the cold. She held a bag with homemade soup, fresh bread, and a scarf she had knitted herself. "You didn't think I would let you starve, did you?" she teased, wrapping her arms around me. The warmth of that moment lingers in my memory more vividly than any Christmas gift my parents ever bought. Later, when I was brave enough to submit some of my drawings to a small student gallery, she came without telling anyone. I was nervous, standing in the corner while strangers examined my work. Then I saw her, standing quietly near one of my pieces, studying it with the intensity she once reserved for family photographs. After the crowd moved on, she touched my hand and whispered, "Never doubt this, Natalie. There is truth in what you create." That night, walking her back to her hotel, she told me something that would echo in my mind for years. "One day, justice will come for you, but you must be patient enough to wait for it." At the time, I did not fully understand what she meant. To me, it sounded like comfort, perhaps even wishful thinking, but her words planted a seed deep inside. Whenever I felt the urge to give up, when my parents' voices haunted me with accusations of failure, I recalled her certainty. Justice will come. I clung to that hope the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. She became my anchor, my empathy point in a family that treated me like an outsider. Daniel never noticed. My parents dismissed her kindness as grandmotherly indulgence. But I knew better. I recognized the deliberate care in every envelope, every visit, every whispered encouragement. She saw me in ways no one else cared to. She believed in the part of me my parents tried to erase. Looking back now, I realize she was more than just a loving grandmother. She was quietly positioning herself as my ally, preparing me for a moment I could not yet imagine. She never spoiled me with promises or exaggerated praise. Instead, she gave me steady faith, small but unshakable. That faith carried me through the years when I stood alone. Her presence was not loud, but it was constant. And sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths. The morning of the funeral carried a silence that felt heavier than the black dress I wore. The church in Boston was filled with polished marble, stained glass, and the scent of lilies placed carefully along the aisles. Every detail screamed dignity, wealth, and tradition, as if grief itself had to be staged to maintain our family's perfect image. People whispered in hushed tones, not from sorrow, but from awe at the display of status. When I walked through the entrance, no one really looked at me. Their eyes followed Daniel, who moved beside my parents like a natural extension of their pride. He greeted each guest with a practiced handshake, nodding graciously as old colleagues and distant relatives praised his composure. To them, he was the grieving grandson, the rising star of the Brooks legacy, the one destined to carry the family name forward. I, on the other hand, slipped into the shadows of the hall. My shoes echoed faintly against the floor, but no one turned. I found a place near the side aisle, far from the front pews, reserved for immediate family. Technically, I belonged there, but my presence felt unwelcome, like an afterthought. I could sense the judgment in the way relatives glanced at me only briefly, then shifted their eyes away as though even acknowledgement might upset the balance of appearances. During the service, as the minister spoke about my grandmother's generosity and grace, my chest tightened. She had been the only one who saw me fully, and now even her voice was gone. I wanted to stand and say something, to speak about the afternoons we shared, the notes she sent, the words she left with me. But when I saw my mother's rigid shoulders and my father's impassive face, I remained silent. My memories of her seemed to belong only to me, not to this carefully orchestrated spectacle. The contrast between Daniel and me grew sharper with each passing moment. People leaned in close to him, offering condolences laced with admiration. "She must have been so proud of you," one woman whispered, clutching his hand. "You've accomplished so much already." Another man, a business associate of my father, clapped Daniel on the back, telling him he was the future of the Brooks empire. Daniel accepted it all with a solemn smile, his grief polished into something almost admirable. Meanwhile, I stood alone, watching the sea of black coats move past me without pause. No one asked how I felt. No one told me she would be proud of me. My grief was invisible, as though my bond with her had never existed. I clutched the folded program in my hand until the paper wrinkled, needing something tangible to hold, while the weight of dismissal pressed harder against me. When the casket was carried out, I followed behind the crowd, keeping my distance. The winter air outside bit into my skin, but I stayed near the back of the procession. My parents walked arm in arm with Daniel, their faces etched with the perfect amount of controlled sorrow. Cameras clicked as if the funeral itself was a press event. Reporters stood respectfully at a distance, taking note of the Brooks family and their polished composure. I wanted to scream that this wasn't the whole truth, that the woman inside that casket had been more than a matriarch of wealth and elegance. She had been my ally, my anchor, the one person who whispered hope when everyone else told me I was worthless. But instead of speaking, I stayed silent, letting the cold settle in my bones. That day, I realized grief could be lonely, even in a crowded room. It was not the absence of people that hurt. It was the absence of recognition. Daniel stood bathed in praise while I remained on the fringe, grieving not only for my grandmother, but for the place in my family I never truly had. After the funeral service ended, the guests slowly dispersed, leaving only family and a select few invited to the will reading. The walk from the church to my grandmother's law office felt endless, each step echoing with the unspoken knowledge that something final awaited us. I kept my head down, the wind tugging at my coat as Daniel walked confidently beside my parents, already looking like the heir apparent. When we arrived, the atmosphere shifted. The law office smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. We were guided into a paneled room with oak walls and heavy leather chairs arranged around a long mahogany table. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, its rhythm both calming and unnerving. Every detail of the room seemed chosen to emphasize seriousness, permanence, and wealth. I slipped into a seat near the middle, not at the head, but not at the edge either. Daniel sat directly opposite the lawyer's chair, my father's hand resting proudly on his shoulder. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace, her gaze sharp as if preparing for battle. Aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the remaining seats, whispering quietly while pretending to be somber. No one looked at me for long. As the silence stretched, my mind betrayed me, pulling up memories of all the moments that had led to this point. I thought about the dinner table conversations when I was a teenager, my father animatedly discussing stocks, while Daniel interrupted with confident predictions about markets he barely understood. My parents laughed, impressed by his boldness, as if his words carried wisdom far beyond his years. I remembered doodling on a napkin, sketching figures and faces because the language of numbers left me cold. My father noticed once, shook his head, and muttered that I was wasting time. Daniel smirked, and my cheeks burned. The room around me blurred for a moment as memory bled into the present. I could almost hear my father's voice again, that same mix of disdain and finality. Danielle has the mind for business. You, Natalie, have your little hobbies. Don't expect the world to reward you for them. My chest tightened, and I clasped my hands in my lap, willing myself not to fidget. Then another memory surfaced, softer but sharper in its impact. My grandmother's hand on mine one late evening in her library. She had poured me tea, the china rattling gently as she set it down. Her eyes, wise and almost mischievous, studied me with unusual seriousness. "Natalie," she said, "things are not what you think. You see the surface, but beneath it, truths lie hidden. One day you will understand." At the time, I thought she meant the family dynamic, the way Daniel was elevated while I was diminished. But now, sitting in this room, her words pulsed like a heartbeat inside my memory. I shifted in my chair as whispers swelled around me. An aunt speculated in a hushed voice about how much Daniel would inherit, while another relative nodded knowingly. My name was never spoken. The tension in my shoulders grew heavier, a weight pressing down until even breathing felt like work. The lawyer entered quietly, a tall man with silver hair and sharp glasses. He placed a thick folder on the table and adjusted his cufflinks before taking his seat. The chatter stopped immediately, replaced by an expectant hush. My palms grew damp, and I wiped them discreetly against my skirt. Before opening the folder, the lawyer cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over us. He tapped a pen gently against the wood, the sound striking like a drum in the silence. My stomach knotted. Every instinct told me that something was about to change, but I couldn't tell whether it would destroy me or finally give me the acknowledgement I had craved all my life. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth curved in quiet confidence. My parents sat rigid, their anticipation almost regal. I, on the other hand, felt like an outsider trespassing in a room meant for chosen heirs. My heart pounded as if it wanted to escape my chest. The lawyer finally broke the silence. "We are here today to honor the wishes of Eleanor Brooks, who left specific instructions for this reading." His voice was steady, measured, giving nothing away. He opened the folder, carefully pulling out a sealed envelope with a crimson wax stamp. He placed it on the table, letting the sight of it linger before speaking again. "This will take time," he said, "so I ask for patience. There are matters that must be addressed in order, just as she instructed." As the first line of the will was prepared to be spoken, I felt my grandmother's voice echo once more inside my head. "Things are not what you think." The words rang like a warning, or perhaps a promise. I straightened in my chair, pulse racing, knowing the moment I had both dreaded and longed for was finally beginning. The words had barely left the lawyer's mouth when the room erupted. My father shot to his feet, his face flushed crimson, the veins in his neck straining as he shouted, "She must have lost her mind! Eleanor was confused in her final years. This cannot be taken seriously." His voice thundered against the wood-paneled walls, shaking the air with a force that felt almost physical. My mother followed immediately, her tone sharper than glass. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her pearl bracelet jangling as she cried, "You manipulated her. Admit it, Natalie. You tricked her into believing you deserved any part of this family's legacy." Her words sliced through the silence like knives, each accusation heavier than the last. I sat frozen, not from fear, but from choice. Their voices filled the room, but I let the storm rage around me without adding fuel. My father's fists pounded against the table, the sound reverberating like gunfire. He was always so careful in public, the perfect gentleman, but here the mask shattered. My mother clutched at his sleeve, half to steady herself, half to keep him from lunging forward. Daniel's composure snapped next. He slammed his palm against the polished wood so violently the pens on the table rattled. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked on me with unfiltered fury. "You don't deserve this," he spat. "You've never done anything. For this family. You've always been the weak one, the outsider. How could she leave you something like this?" His voice broke on the last word, not with sorrow, but with disbelief. The relatives who had been whispering before now sat in stunned silence. Their gazes darted between the spectacle of my parents, unraveling, and me, still seated, still quiet, refusing to rise to the bait. My silence carried a weight none of them expected. For once, I was not the one scrambling to justify myself, not the one apologizing for existing. The lawyer tried to regain control. He lifted his hand, clearing his throat, but my father cut him off with another roar. "This is a disgrace. I will contest it. She was not in her right mind." His words were aimed at the lawyer, but his eyes never left me, as if I had orchestrated the entire thing. My mother leaned across the table, her face inches from mine, her breath trembling with rage. "You poisoned her against us. Admit it, Natalie. Admit that you've been scheming all along." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I held her gaze with steady calm, letting the silence answer for me. Inside, my heart raced, but outwardly, I gave them nothing. My refusal to engage was my weapon. Their shouting only made their desperation clearer, while my stillness grew louder than their noise. Daniel's chair screeched across the floor as he stood abruptly. "Say something," he demanded, slamming both fists on the table this time. His voice cracked, anger spiraling into panic. "Do you think you've won? You think this changes anything?" I looked at him, not with triumph, but with a kind of sorrow. He was too blind to see that, in this moment, the balance of power had shifted. They could scream until their throats tore, but I had already been given something they could not take away. Recognition. The relatives began to murmur again, unease rippling through them. Some avoided my parents' eyes, ashamed of their loss of control. Others glanced at me with something resembling respect, or perhaps curiosity. For the first time in my life, I was not invisible. The lawyer finally raised his voice above the chaos. "Please, if you cannot conduct yourselves with civility, I will be forced to suspend this reading." His words carried authority, but the damage was already done. The pristine image of my family had shattered in front of witnesses. I leaned back in my chair, hands folded neatly in my lap, and allowed the silence to linger. I did not need to shout. I did not need to defend. The louder they raged, the clearer the truth became. Their power was crumbling, and in that stillness, I understood what my grandmother had promised me long ago. Justice did not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it came in the form of silence, unshakable and undeniable. The chaos inside that wood-paneled room did not stay contained. Within days, details of the will reading began leaking into the world beyond those heavy doors. At Iao, first, I thought it was just whispers passed among extended relatives, but soon the story spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, Boston's local papers ran headlines about the Brooks family feud, and by the next, national outlets were dissecting the spectacle. Family empire cracks, Brooks' fortune divided by scandal, one headline screamed across a glossy cover. Another magazine featured Daniel's photograph next to mine, the caption blunt and cruel: "The Golden Son versus the Forgotten Daughter." It was surreal to see my name in bold print, no longer dismissed or erased, but twisted into a narrative I had no control over. Talk shows invited legal analysts to speculate. They debated whether my grandmother had been of sound mind, whether I had influenced her decisions, whether this was a simple inheritance dispute or the unraveling of a dynasty. Clips of my parents leaving the lawyer's office in anger replayed on the evening news, their fury frozen on screen for the world to consume. I became a symbol, though not in the way I had ever imagined. For some, I was the underdog who had endured years of silence only to finally receive recognition. Strangers wrote letters saying they saw their own families in mine, that they too had been overlooked, overshadowed, told they would never measure up. They called my quiet reaction at the will reading dignified, even brave. A few said it gave them the courage to stop apologizing for existing, but others despised me. Online forums painted me as greedy, ungrateful, a manipulator who had seized her grandmother's affection to undermine the rightful heirs. Anonymous comments accused me of tearing apart a perfect family for selfish gain. The cruelty of strangers, typed behind glowing screens, pierced deeper than I expected. I told myself not to read them, but late at night I found myself scrolling through the words until they blurred. Even among acquaintances, the division was clear. Former classmates from NYU reached out with congratulations, calling it poetic justice after all the times they'd seen me struggle. Yet, old family friends crossed the street to avoid me in Boston, their polite smiles evaporating into tight lips. They did not want to be associated with scandal. In their eyes, Daniel was still the shining sun, and I was the stain on the Brooks name. What stunned me most was the way the narrative refused to stay private. It wasn't just about money anymore. It had become a story of loyalty, betrayal, justice, and pride. Dinner tables across America debated my life as if I were a character in a drama. Some said I represented every child who had been underestimated. Others insisted I embodied entitlement. The world had taken our pain and turned it into a mirror, reflecting its own divisions. Reporters camped outside my apartment building in New York. Their cameras waited for me when I tried to leave for work, their microphones extended like weapons. Questions bombarded me. "Natalie, do you think your parents will reconcile with you? Did you manipulate your grandmother? How does it feel to break your family apart?" I kept walking, never answering, but the silence they once mocked now became a headline in itself. Natalie Brooks speaks with silence. In quiet moments, I thought of Grandma Eleanor. She had warned me long ago that justice would not be gentle, that it would come with its own storm. Her voice echoed in my memory. "One day, the truth will defend itself, but you must endure the noise that follows." Now I understood what she meant. Recognition carried a price, and that price was public scrutiny. Yet, through all the noise, something remarkable began to happen. For the first time in my life, people who had never heard of me began to see me. My silence, once used against me, became a kind of strength in their eyes. They debated my motives, yes, but they could not erase me anymore. I was no longer invisible. The irony was painful. My parents had shouted at me to go make my own money, and now the world was watching as if my very existence challenged their empire. They tried to drown me in accusations, but in doing so, they exposed themselves. The louder they screamed, the more obvious it became that something deeper had always been broken within our family. I did not need to defend myself to every headline or stranger. The fallout itself told the story. Some saw greed, others saw justice, but all of them saw me. And perhaps that was my grandmother's final gift, not just inheritance, but the undeniable truth that my silence could be louder than their rage. The headlines had barely cooled when the next blow arrived. A courier knocked on my apartment door early on a gray Tuesday, asked for my signature, and placed a stiff envelope in my hands. Inside was a thick stack of papers from my parents' attorneys, alleging undue influence and exploitation of an elderly person. They wanted the court to void my grandmother's will and freeze the trust. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the legal stamps. The room smelled like last night's coffee. My hands began to shake. I tried to lift my mug and failed. Liquid trembled against the rim and tapped my lip. It tasted bitter. I set it down and told myself to breathe. My tongue felt heavy, my throat tight, as if swallowing would betray me. I called the lawyer who had read the will. His assistant put me on hold and soft piano music floated through the line. When he came on, his voice was steady. He said we had anticipated this. He told me to bring the papers immediately, not to respond directly to my parents, and to document any contact. I wrote what he said on a sticky note even though the words blurred. My fingers left faint smudges of ink. On the walk to his office, the city felt louder than usual. Snow flurries brushed the sidewalks and stung my cheeks. Car horns cracked against my skull. I hugged the envelope to my chest like a shield. A street vendor offered a pretzel, and I shook my head, unable to imagine keeping anything down. In the conference room, he reviewed the filings page by page. He explained that their claims centered on capacity and pressure, that they would try to paint me as a manipulator who had isolated my grandmother and engineered her decisions. He also reminded me of what we had: video recordings of meetings, medical letters, memos kept for years. Facts can be quiet, he said, but they do not disappear. I nodded and tried to steady my breathing. Then came the questions I had dreaded. Had I ever discussed inheritance with my grandmother? Had I ever accepted gifts without telling my parents? Had I ever driven her to appointments alone? Each answer mattered. I told the truth. I had never asked for money. She visited my shows sometimes, yes, and she bought pieces under other names. I told him about the soup she brought in winter, the scarf she knit, the letters she wrote in careful blue ink. He listened and took notes, then looked up with a measured calm that steadied the room. When I left the office, dusk had settled. I stopped by a small corner diner and ordered tea and toast. The tea cooled untouched. I broke the toast into pieces, felt the dry crumb against my tongue, and could not swallow. My body refused. I wrapped the pieces in a napkin and slipped them into my bag like a secret. Over the next days, the summons became routine. Emails, certified mail, requests for records, calendar invites for depositions. Each ding of my phone made my stomach clench. I started keeping a notebook by the door so I could write down every delivery and time. At night, I woke to the sound of my own heartbeat. I pressed my palms to my ribs and counted until the panic receded. Friends asked if I wanted company. I said I needed quiet. In truth, I needed to remember my grandmother's voice. I played a voicemail she had left months before, her laugh warm, her words simple. I am proud of you, Natalie. You see things clearly. The message steadied me more than sleep. The first hearing date arrived, printed in bold on a clean white page. I pinned the notice to my board and stared until the edges blurred. Fear did not mean I was unprepared, I told myself. Fear meant I understood the stakes. I was ready. I washed my mug, set it to dry, and packed a folder with everything my attorney had requested. When I locked the door behind me, my hands still shook, but they were steady enough to turn the key. I spent the night after the first hearing alone in my apartment, lights low, noise softened by falling snow. The kettle clicked off, and I forgot to pour the water. I pulled my grandmother's journal from the shelf and set it on the table, its leather worn smooth by her hands. The ribbon bookmark held a page I had read many times, though my hands shook. Her handwriting filled the paper in dark blue ink, steady and patient. She dated the entry 3 winters ago, when I was working double shifts and sleeping in bursts. She wrote about stopping by a gallery to watch a young woman guide people through her collages. She never wrote my name, but I knew the scene. I remembered the blue scarf I wore that night. She described how the woman spoke, careful at first, then bright with conviction, like a match struck in a quiet room. I heard her voice while I traced the letters with my finger. Natalie, you are not fragile. You are precise. You see what is layered beneath, and you will need that sight when people try to blur the outlines. Let them talk louder. You will see clearer. The words landed like a hand on my shoulder. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of paper and lavender oil that clung to the pages. Doubt crept in anyway. What if the court believed them? What if the recordings were dismissed, or the signatures questioned, or the trust tangled in legal knots for years? I thought about the bills on my desk, and the hours I missed at work, and the exhaustion ran through me like cold water. I pressed my palms to the table and felt how small I was against the weight of their money, their friends, their practiced certainty. I turned another page. She had sketched a square, a rough plan of a room with tall windows and a bench in the center. Underneath she wrote, "Let the light decide where people stand." The line made me smile through tears. She believed spaces could tell truth without raising a voice. I imagined the gallery she hoped I would open, the sun-warming brick, the quiet hum before a crowd arrived. The night pushed on. I made tea and watched the steam fade. I read another entry, a memory of us walking the harbor, her arm linked with mine, her steps small but determined. She wrote that courage often looks like ordinary persistence, choosing again to show up where you are not invited. I set the journal down and stared at the wall until my eyes adjusted to the dark. For a few minutes, I let the fear have its say. I pictured losing. I pictured being called a thief. I pictured apologizing for something I did not do. The thoughts crowded in, heavy and loud. Then her voice returned, a little amused, a little fierce. "Natalie, the truth does not vanish because someone shouts at it. Stand where the light can find you." I wiped my face and opened the window a crack. Snow filtered in, clean and quiet. I gathered the filings, stacked them neatly, and slid the journal on top like a compass. I wrote a morning list, call the attorney, confirm the timeline, pack the exhibits, eat breakfast. The items were small. Each one steadied the ground under my feet. I turned off the lamp, left the journal by the kettle, and told myself what she told me for years. Keep going, step by step, until the door opens, because it will. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse smelled like floor wax and cold coffee. I sat behind my attorney at the petitioner's table across from my parents and Daniel, hands folded, breath measured. The judge entered, robes moving like a dark wave, and the room rose. When we sat again, their lawyer launched into a polished story about manipulation and influence. He said, "I isolated my grandmother, that I guided her choices. That sentiment had replaced judgment." His voice carried confidence that once felt impossible to counter. Our turn began with records that did not raise their voices. The drafting lawyer testified under oath, describing meetings across years with dates, minutes, and witnesses. A calendar showed appointments stretching back 5 years. He explained the entities my grandmother created to shield decisions, why signatures were notarized, and why confirmations were videotaped after private talks. The screen flickered, and there she was, steady and clear, stating her wishes in her own words and looking into the camera with the same calm that once settled my nerves. A physician followed, the internist who had cared for her for 20 years. He reviewed cognitive assessments from the same period, scores consistent and strong. She was competent when she made those decisions. A handwriting expert confirmed what the notary had sworn. Financial records showed the origin of funds, transfers to the trust, and the purchase of the building through an LLC formed long before her final illness. The paper trail drew a straight line. Their lawyer tried to shake the story. He asked whether I had ever been alone with her. "Yes," I said, "because I was her granddaughter and we loved each other." He asked if she had attended my shows. yes, under other names, which he suggested proved secrecy. Our counsel replied that privacy is not fraud. He suggested that my grandmother was estranged from my parents. The videos disagreed. In them, she thanked them for what they had done for the family, then returned to her decision about me with steady resolve. I watched my parents as each piece landed. My father stared at the table, jaw locked. My mother held a tissue that never touched her eyes. Daniel shifted, his leg bouncing until the bailiff glanced over, and the movement stopped. At one point, I thought about the way they had laughed when I chose my major, and the thought passed across my chest like a shadow, then moved on. Closing arguments felt smaller than the evidence. Their lawyer warned about precedent and family harmony. Ours spoke about autonomy and the right to define legacy. The judge listened without expression, then called a recess. When she returned, the courtroom seemed to hold one breath. Her ruling came in clear blocks. The petition to invalidate the will and trust was denied. The court found no evidence of undue influence, no lack of capacity, no procedural defect. The sealed instructions were consistent with long-term planning. The trust remained in force. Costs would be shared according to statute. She thanked counsel and stood. I did not smile. Relief moved through me like a tide, but my face stayed composed. I looked at my parents and saw not villains, but people who had believed their story so completely that nothing else could make sense. My father's shoulders sagged. My mother stared at the empty bench as if it might change its mind. Daniel exhaled and shoved his hands into his pockets like a boy caught doing something reckless. We filed out into a hallway washed in winter light. Reporters clustered near the doors, voices rising, microphones angled. My attorney said we would not be speaking, and we kept walking. Outside, the air tasted like snow. I paused on the steps and let the cold find my lungs. I thought of my grandmother's journal, the line about letting light decide where people stand. The light had chosen. This was not triumph. It was repair, slow and exact. It was the moment the shouting stopped mattering because the record spoke for itself. I placed my hand on the railing, felt the iron chill against my palm, and took the next step down, steady and sure. The keys to the South End building clicked in my palm like a starting gun. When I opened the door the first morning, dust swirled in gold ribbons through the light, and the room looked like a stage waiting for a cast. Exposed red brick ran the length of the walls, rough and honest. The floors were old oak, scuffed by time, yet they held a patient shine. I flipped the breakers and a band of warm track lights blinked awake, bathing the space in a soft amber glow. I did not hire a crew for the first week. I wanted my body written into the walls. I taped the baseboards and climbed a ladder, rolling paint along the ceiling until my shoulders burned. I sanded the trim, wiped it down, and brushed it with a satin finish that caught the light like silk. Every stroke steadied me. After months of depositions and courtrooms, the work offered a language without argument. The roller hissed, the brush whispered, and the space answered with quiet acceptance. I mapped sightlines with blue tape on the floor, walking the length of the room again and again. I measured distances so that frames would hang in an even procession, center lines matched, heights consistent, negative space, breathing between pieces. I learned where the afternoon sun traveled, and where the bulbs needed dimming to keep glare from glass. I labeled outlets and mounted new rails, silver and clean. When I stepped back, the walls resembled ruled paper, ready for sentences. During breaks, I sat on the windowsill and watched neighbors pass with coffee. Some stopped to read the permit taped to the glass. A few cupped their hands against the pane to peer inside. I waved and smiled, then returned to the ladder. The building taught me its rhythms. The pipes knocked at 9. The heat rested at noon. The wood settled after sunset, a hymn for anyone who listened. When the infrastructure held, I began inviting artists. I called former classmates who worked 2 jobs and painted after midnight. I reached out to a sculptor who welded in a shared yard in Roxbury and a photographer who made portraits with a handmade camera and a patience I envied. I wrote to a painter I had admired from afar, a woman who layered torn maps into landscapes. To each I offered clear contracts, and fair splits. No one had ever offered me those. The first time someone wrote back yes, I printed the schedule and pinned it to the office corkboard with a brass tack. I also tended to the upstairs apartment. I scrubbed the farmhouse sink until it shone like a quiet moon. I laid rugs in warm tones and placed a small table by the window where morning light gathered. On a shelf, I lined my grandmother's journal, a few dog-eared art books, and a jar of pencils. I framed a photograph of her standing outside a hardware store in the 60s, chin lifted against the wind. The place did not feel grand. It felt true. Every corner said, "You can begin again here." As the opening drew near, I rehearsed the hanging light choreography. Crates arrived, and I lifted each work with cotton gloves, slow and sure. I checked wires and bumpers, then leveled the frames until the bubble floated between marks. I printed labels, black on white, clean type, no fuss. I adjusted the dimmers and walked the center line to make sure the sequence breathed. I arranged a bench at the midpoint so visitors could rest and take in the room with a single breath. I kept one wall open for 3 small pieces of my own. Not a spotlight, only a quiet corner. I polished the glass until it vanished, then stepped back and tried to see the work the way strangers might. The red bricks hummed behind everything, warm and steady. The lights held a soft gold edge. The floor reflected a gentle sheen like still water. The space looked exactly as I had pictured it when I traced a square in my grandmother's journal. It was a house for vision, and it felt like freedom made visible. By the time opening night arrived, the gallery no longer felt like a project. It felt like a pulse. Snow powdered the sidewalks, and a thin line formed outside before the doors even opened. I switched on the lights, and the amber glow flowed across the bricks like sunrise. Candles flickered on the desk near the guest book, and a bowl of green apples held their own quiet shine. I checked the labels one last time, smoothed the corner of a poster, then pulled the door wide and welcomed the first guests. They came in waves, friends from school, collectors with winter scarves, neighbors who had watched me paint through the windows, and artists carrying a private electricity in their eyes. The room warmed with voices and the soft thrum of footsteps on oak. The red brick held the sound and handed it back. Gentle. I moved through the crowd with a calm I did not expect, pausing to refill water, adjusting a dimmer, answering a question about a process I knew by heart. One painter stood near her piece, a map collaged into a blue horizon, and held the hand of her mother who had taken 2 buses to arrive. Heir. Sculptor hovered by a steel form that threw a soft shadow like folded wings. The photographer explained how long exposures make time visible. Everywhere I looked, I saw small constellations forming, strangers meeting in front of work that called them by name. Midway through the evening, a snow flurry swept past the windows and the door sighed on its hinges. More guests stepped inside, cheeks bright from the cold. A critic from a small arts paper shook my hand, took a card, and promised to reach out next week. The room felt fully alive. I checked the corners where crowds gathered and repositioned the bench to open space for wheelchairs. I checked on the corner where my 3 pieces hung. They were not central, but they were mine, and I wanted to be brave enough to keep them on the wall. A woman in a gray coat stood there, alone, reading the label. She leaned in, stepped back, leaned in again. The way people do when they are listening to something only they can hear. Her hands rose to her face, and she pressed her fingers gently under her eyes. When I came closer, I saw tears balanced along her lashes. I asked if she needed water. She shook her head and smiled through the tears. Her voice was soft. She told me she had not planned to come inside, that she had been walking home from work, and the light from the windows made her curious. One of the collages reminded her of a kitchen in another city where her mother used to hum while peeling oranges. The memory had arrived with the color, and it had knocked on a door she thought was sealed. I nodded and stood beside her, not speaking, because the silence felt holy. In my mind, I heard my grandmother say that courage often looks like ordinary persistence. I had hung the pieces quietly, without pointing, and someone found what she needed. That was the promise she had made to me, that if I built a room honest enough, the work would do its own speaking. The woman took a tissue from her sleeve, breathed and thanked me for making a place where she could feel safe enough to remember. I thanked her for trusting the room. Later, as the crowd thinned, I stood near the entrance and watched the last guest step into the night. The apples were fewer, the candles low, the floor marked by a gentle map of shoes. The quiet that followed did not feel empty. It felt like a chord still ringing. I locked the door and turned back toward the gallery. The bricks glowed in the last of the light. I walked to the center and sat on the bench. I let the day settle through me until my thoughts went still. On the far wall, the 3 small works waited without demand. I pictured my grandmother sitting where I sat, chin lifted the way it looked in that old photograph, and I spoke to the room the way I used to speak to her. Thank you for the chance to begin. Thank you for staying when I felt alone. Thank you for believing that a house of art can shape a life. The heater sighed, the dimmers hummed, and a bit of snow tapped the window. I took the guest book to the desk and read the first pages, loops of names, notes about color, and a line in heavy blue ink that made me stop. It said, "Your grandmother would be proud. Keep going." I pressed my hand flat on the paper as if it could answer back. I turned off the lights one by one and let darkness rebuild the room. I climbed the stairs, the keys warm in my pocket, and felt the future lean forward. Not loud, but certain. The morning after the first review ran, a soft knock sounded on the gallery door. Daniel stood on the sidewalk with his collar turned up against the wind. No grin, no press-ready confidence. I unlocked the door and stepped back. He moved inside slowly, as if the room might judge him. "I will not take your time," he said, voice careful. "I wanted to see what you built." We sat on the bench under the track lights while the heater hummed. He stared at a collaged horizon, hands jammed into his coat pockets, shoulders tight. "I thought winning would fix it," he said. "The money, the praise, the meetings, the dinners, the calls. It is loud, but it is hollow. I come home and hear static." He rubbed his temple, then lowered his hand. "I keep seeing Grandma looking at you like she spoke a language I never learned." "You came to tell me that?" I asked. "I came to admit I was wrong," he said. "I treated you like a rival inside a game I did not even choose. Maybe Grandma was right. You were the one who deserved this." The words landed like heavy stones, not thrown, simply set down. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I do not sleep," he said. "Since the ruling, I have signed papers and said the right things, then stared at the ceiling all night. I thought a number in a bank account would silence the ache. It did not. I do not remember the last time I made anything with my hands." "What do you want from me?" I asked, not unkindly. "Not money," he said. "I want to know how you carry pressure without letting it poison you. I want to be more than a result." I told him the truth. Fear did not vanish. I still woke and counted my breath. What helped was work that demanded presence. "When I hang a frame, the bubble either centers or it does not," I said. "The rail does not care about last names." A small and human smile crossed his face, the one I knew from before the applause. He looked around the room and nodded. "I told myself I hated this place because it proved I lost," he said. "Now I see it proves something else. You stood up without screaming." He rose and reached for his coat. "I am sorry," he said, meeting my eyes. "For the jokes and the digs, the years I helped make you small. I wore a crown and forgot it was made of wire." I did not hug him. I held his gaze until his shoulders loosened. "Thank you for coming," I said. "If you want the quiet again, the door is not closed." When he left, the latch clicked and the room returned to its slow breath. I felt no triumph and no heat of revenge, only a clear tenderness for the boy who once drew rocket ships in the margins, before he learned to speak only in margins. I swept the floor in long strokes, steady and even, and let the light do its work on the red brick walls. 2 weeks later, a cream envelope arrived, addressed in my father's exact block letters. It was hand-delivered. I held it a long time before I broke the seal. The paper carried the scent of his office, ink and cologne, and policy. He did not begin with "Dear." He wrote my name in a comma, then moved through careful sentences. "The court's decision is clear," he wrote, "and I will respect it." He acknowledged that the gallery had drawn attention from clients he respected, that several associates had mentioned my professionalism. The words read like a ledger, reluctant but precise. There was no apology. He did not mention his voice raised in the will reading or the accusations that followed. He wrote about the company, about markets that shifted without Grandma's calls, about investors who wanted reassurance. The lines did not blame me, which felt new. They sounded like the language he trusted, numbers and momentum, and through that language I heard something he rarely showed: uncertainty. Then the letter turned and surprised me. He admitted he had underestimated the value of what he called curation, the ability to choose and arrange with clarity. "Leadership is more than acquisition," he wrote. "Sometimes it is attention practiced over time." He added that he had not been trained to see that. He asked if we might meet for lunch in a neutral place. I read the paragraph twice. My grandmother's warning rose in my mind. "Do not confuse restraint with void." My father's sentences were not warm, but they were not empty. They felt like the first boards laid across a broken span. He continued. "Your mother is not ready," he wrote. "Her anger sits close to the surface. She feels replaced in a story she helped write. Do not take her silence as final." He did not excuse her. He did not excuse himself. "Families are not balance sheets," he added, and I behaved as if they were. He mentioned Daniel in a single line. "Your brother seems tired. I am giving him space." He did not know about the bench or the conversation under the soft gold lights. He did not ask me to fix it. He simply admitted he did not know how to help a son who had always been told what to want. Near the end came a detail that loosened something in my chest. He wrote that he had walked past the gallery after dark and looked through the window. He saw a woman in a gray coat standing in front of a small collage. He watched her shoulders shake once, then steady. He did not come inside. He stood on the sidewalk and felt, for the first time, that what I had made carried a usefulness he had never learned to measure. He closed with a sentence I read again and again. "You have done more than I thought you could, and differently than I ever would, and I can see that it works." He signed his name with the same crisp stroke he used on deals. No flourish, no drama, only ink and intention. I set the letter on the desk and looked around the apartment above the gallery. Late light laid a soft stripe across the floor. The radiator clicked and settled. I poured water and felt the months of fight slip from my shoulders like a coat finally hung where it belongs. The letter was not love. It was a door cracked open. I thought about answering. A simple yes to lunch, a time and a place, clear boundaries. Instead, I folded the letter along its crease and slid it into my grandmother's journal, the one with the sketch of a room with tall windows and a bench at the center. I told myself I would decide in the morning. I did not write that night. I watered the plants and checked the locks. I stood at the stairwell and listened to the gallery breathe. Down below, the bricks held their warmth and the frames kept their lines. Repair rarely arrives as a rush. It lives in increments, in notes passed under doors, in steps taken without noise. My father had not said the words I once begged to hear, but he had named the edge of what he did not understand. That was enough for now. I turned off the lights and sat on the last step with the journal against my palm. Outside, a bus exhaled and moved on. I rested my hands on the cool wood and let the quiet gather. The story had shifted toward a shore I could not yet see, and for once I chose to wait for morning. A year after I turned on the lights for the first time, the gallery moves with its own steady rhythm. Mornings begin with the scrape of the key and the warm glow over red brick. Afternoons bring neighbors with coffee, students with sketchbooks, and collectors who ask real questions. Nights end with me logging sales, sweeping the oak floor, and locking up with a kind of peace I never knew at home. In spring, I launched the Eleanor Brooks Scholarship for Emerging Artists. Applications arrived from dorm rooms, basements, shared kitchens, and borrowed studios. We selected 5 recipients, each with a voice you can hear the moment you see their work. The award covers rent and materials and pairs them with a season of mentorship inside these walls. During orientation, I told them what I needed to hear at 20. Your work matters, and you are allowed to take up space. Shows grew bolder. We mounted an exhibition about memory and place, small pieces about kitchens, stairwells, bus stops, and quiet corners of the city. A counselor stopped by to ask how the city could help build more studios. Local press covered the program as a victory against sameness. I did not chase headlines. I kept doing the work and let the rooms speak. The change I feel most lives in the chorus of voices inside the gallery. A teenager asks a sculptor how to sand an edge safely. A retired carpenter studies a charcoal drawing and talks about grain and shadow. A father kneels beside his daughter and teaches her to step back until a painting comes into focus. I listen and realize that this is what respect sounds like. Sometimes Daniel stands near the back and stays quiet. My father writes brief notes about the scholarship cycle and asks for dates. I answer with clarity and let it rest. My mother does not call. I stopped waiting by the phone. The woman who was once dismissed as useless now unlocks a door that belongs to her, and the room fills with people who feel welcome here. The contrast does not make me bitter. It makes me careful with the power of a key in the morning. The first anniversary falls on a clear winter night. I set out apples and sparkling water, light candles on the desk, and walk the line of frames to check each level. The red brick glows under soft amber light. Guests arrive with bright cheeks and cold hands. Music from a violin student pools by the window. The scholarship cohort drifts toward their pieces with nerves and pride. At 8, I ring a small brass bell and thank everyone for trusting the work. I keep the speech short. This room is for listening, not for me. After the applause, conversation rises again, and I slip to a quiet corner where a photograph hangs above a low shelf. It shows my grandmother outside the first store my grandfather opened, coat buttoned high, hair pulled back by the wind, eyes lit by decision. I touch the frame and whisper the truth that carried me through courtrooms and long nights. You saw me when no one else would. I think about the square she sketched in her journal, a room with tall windows and a bench at the center. I think about the line she wrote, "Let the light decide where people stand." The light did its work. It found me at a table where I once felt invisible, and it brought me here, where the doors open for others who need a place to breathe. Snow begins to fall. I open the gallery door and a group of students steps in, faces bright, shoulders dusted white. One holds a sketchbook. Another clutches a folded flyer with our address. I welcome them and watch them pause at the bench, that small island where a person can feel safe enough to see clearly. A journalist asks for a quote. I say the work knows what it needs, and our job is to build a room that listens. When the night thins, I turn to the camera and speak to the people who carry these stories home. Before we say goodbye, we would love to know where you are watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember this. Sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits quietly until you are ready to open your heart. Take care, and we will see you in the next story. I lock the door when the last guest steps out and the latch settles into place. The room holds a calm that feels like blessing. I dim the lights and climb the stairs with the keys warm in my pocket. Down below, the frames keep their straight lines and the bricks hold their heat. Up above, the kettle begins to sing. A new year waits on the other side of sleep, and I am ready to begin again,